Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Strange Tales 130 from 1964 in Marvel Comics. Is this the oldest comic book I own? Possibly. It's certainly one of the most beat to hell. Even 30 years ago, that's the only way I could ever have afforded this, a very special comic for one big reason. This marks the first appearance of the Beatles in a Marvel comic book, their actual first comics appearance being, I believe, an issue of Del Giant from that summer. The credit for this one surely goes to Stan, eternal trend chaser that he was. The Beatles' first American performance on Ed Sullivan was in February of that year, and this book saw print in December. That was long enough for the creators to have seen the first blush of Beatlemania in the States, but not long enough that they may have been wondering whether or not the book would hit too late to cash in on what was sure to be a short-lived fad. No one had ever seen anything like the Beatles, after all, and no one at this point, not even the band themselves, expected to become any kind of durable cultural fixture. You can see some of that hedging over the strength of the fad on the cover itself. You might expect the Beatles to actually be on the cover, or at least that the name of the band would be somewhere in the top third of the design, not tucked into the right-hand corner, next to the full-size Doctor Strange illustration, and under the headshots of the Human Torch and the Thing in Beatle wigs. As for the story itself, the Beatles appear on exactly one page, climbing a stairwell and running into Johnny, Ben, and their respective main squeezes, Doris Evans and Alicia Masters. They aren't differentiated by name, and Bob Powell, bless his heart, put less than a great deal of effort into likenesses. The Thing and the Torch spend much of the issue tussling with robbers in Beatle wigs, who rob the box office. Frankly, the fact that anyone in this comic can hear themselves think in the first place is remarkable, given all the incessant screaming that famously accompanied the group's every turn during this period. The second half of the book is inarguably far superior to the front half. This was the peak era of Steve Ditko's Doctor Strange, already well into its prime as one of the best strips of its era. Still, regardless of what the cover might tell you, I think it's fair to say more people would have bought this comic for the Beatles than Baron Mordo. By then, Ben and Johnny were on their way out of the door anyway. In just 5 issues, they were replaced as the lead feature in Strange Tales by Nick Fury, agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at New Teen Titans Annual Number 2 from 1983 in DC Comics. If we're laying our cards on the table, I've never quite been able to get into the Titans. I've read the highlights, but something about this particular group of characters has always left me cold. Now, I've still read a fair amount of Titans, even given this, because of the art by the late, great George Perez. I'll read anything he drew, be it early Perez or later Perez. It's all the same to me. The man knew how to draw comic books extraordinarily well, and our book today is no exception. In the first place, Perez is only credited with layouts here. It's also a truism that his layouts were tighter and more detailed than most artists' full pencils. Pablo Marcos is the finisher, and he does an excellent job with Perez's highly detailed, some might even say fussy, compositions. His great strength was not just that he was detail-oriented, or that he drafted interesting layouts, or even that he had a fondness for drawing the ladies. What set Perez above and beyond a crowded field of other very good artists is that he was first and foremost a storyteller. Persnickety detail was only as good as the story it served. Fancy layouts were worthless if they couldn't communicate the progress of a story. Perez's pages are often stacked with tons of teeny tiny panels conveying an immense amount of information. He was co-plotter for many of his assignments, as he's credited here. He had a lot of input into just the kinds of stories he wanted to draw, and George Perez liked drawing dense, downright busy stories where lots of things happen. Annual 2 here is an example from the prime time of the Titans as a franchise, well into the book's tenure as one of DC's hottest books, and its only real competition against Marvel's blockbuster Uncanny X-Men. It's the first appearance of the Adrian Chase Vigilante, who subsequently headlined his own series for 50 issues in the mid-'80s. This version of the Vigilante embodies so many of the tropes of the era's violent crime stories. He's a crusading DA who loses everything fighting the mob and dedicates his life to dispensing justice to the scum who take advantage of the revolving door justice system to hurt people with impunity. There were a lot of characters back then who thought like that in comics and across pop culture. It was a stubbornly reactionary and blinkered view then, and the philosophy hasn't aged well. But I've always thought it to Marv Wolfman's credit that even as he created the guy, he was still never quite sure we should be rooting for him in the first place. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Generation X 95 from 1995 in Marvel Comics. It's been 29 years since the first issue of Marvel's Generation X in the fall of '94, and we're still reeling from the circumstances of one of the strangest rollouts in comic book history. As strong as the book looked out of the gate, it was hamstrung by a few factors. In the first place, the promotional material vastly oversold the concept, with the infamous Generation X collector's preview leading the way by going into great detail about a version of the book and concept that never saw print. In the second, the Age of Apocalypse crossover and Drew to just 4 months into the run, derailing what was already a slow start with 4 issues of another team that only sort of resembled the original. And finally, even after the regular version of the book returned from a 4-month hiatus, it couldn't escape the reality of a maddeningly slow rollout for a team that still wasn't 100% together even by the end of its first year. This annual features the introduction to the main cast of Mondo, a member included in the promo materials who spent well over a year actually getting to meet the rest of the cast. Keeping in mind, of course, that Mondo had been prominent in the team's Age of Apocalypse iteration, so the readers were technically waiting to be introduced to someone they had already met. This was sadly indicative of Marvel's approach at the time. Even the books that sold were beginning to show signs of creative distress. This was Generation X's first annual, and it saw print just a scant few months prior to the company's filing bankruptcy in December. And if you're wondering whether or not it's possible to make good comics under those circumstances, well, there were still a few decent Marvel books being made all through this period, despite everything else, but sadly, more of them read like this than not. Too many names in the credits putting together underwhelming product that seemed more than anything unworthy of the talent brought to bear. So too Generation X 95. The credited artists for this comic book are Ashley Wood and Sean McManus, providing breakdowns, with McManus, Steve Lytle, Bill Sienkiewicz, Dan Panosian, Vince Russell, and Gary Schloner providing finishes. And sure, you can see bits and bobs of Lytle, Sienkiewicz, and Wood, along with the general outlines of what seem to have been relatively loose breakdowns from McManus. But none of those august talents are particularly well served by the finished product, which, if anything, betrays the telltale signs of having been cobbled together at the very last minute. Scott Lobdell was the book's first writer, and to be fair, some of the character work from the main book can be seen developed here. But with so many cooks in this kitchen, it's difficult to see this as anything other than a missed opportunity for a book that, after a year of publication, already seemed like a laundry list of missed opportunities. The best part is the backup by Lobdell and Jeff Matsuda, a diary excerpt featuring insight into the mystery of M, which went on way too long and ended in a confusing manner that they basically pretend to this day never happened. Pretty sweet Michael Golden cover, however, the best part of a generally underwhelming package. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Beware the Creeper #1 from 2003 in DC Vertigo. By the early years of the 21st century, DC had already stepped away, for the most part, from the habit of relaunching DC Universe mainstays with new mature readers' hooks. The imprint was by this time well into its second wind, with the success of new series such as Why the Last Man and Fables, both then in their first years of publication. But the occasional DCU reimagining still snuck its way across the transom, and who better to uphold the tradition in these lean years than the Creeper, always one to show up when he's least expected, and no less here. Beware the Creepers and Elseworlds in all but name, giving us a vision of Steve Ditko's deathless avatar of insanity as a product of 1920s Paris, an era defined by both its post-war profligacy and artistic fecundity. Sure enough, our Creeper's a product of the Surrealist movement, rubbing elbows with Man Ray and Andre Breton, and of course Hemingway shows up as well, eternally insecure hanger-on as he was in this period. The real appeal here is the formative work by Mr. Cliff Chiang, in 2023 one of the most well-regarded auteurs in the industry, but 20 years ago merely another kid fresh off a year drawing detective comics for Judd Winnick, as well as the fond-to-see Batman Elseworlds, The Golden Streets of Gotham with Jen Van Meter. Here Chiang is paired with Jason Hall, then most famous for his collaboration with fellow up-and-comer Matt Kindt on the Pistol Whip graphic novels. What's remarkable in hindsight is just how good Chiang already was at this early date, still 20 years out from the epical Lonely City. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Nth Man the Ultimate Ninja #2 from 1989 in Marvel Comics. After the breakneck pace of the first issue, the follow-up slows down just a tick, but only just a tick. The titular Ultimate Ninja is stuck trying to escape from Russia during World War III, accompanied by his mentor Dr. Irving Yagyu, DDS, and Sergeant Deb Levins, who the narration informs us is a cute Green Beret, the armed forces in this world having allowed women into combat roles at least 25 years before ours. This trio is left to fend for themselves in the wake of the desolation of the Chinese Army's retreat from Moscow, although said retreat may just turn out to have been a feint for the purpose of destroying the Soviets' main motor rifle divisions. Yes, we are in the trusted hands of Larry Hama, someone who understands war and, what's more, understands how to build adventure stories around the events of war. Again, this series removes the layer of euphemism that swaddled Hama's G.I. Joe. That book would never show a bloody heap of bodies lying under a wall after a summary execution by retreating forces, as this does. For a series supposedly built around the conflict between an omnipotent psychic and the world's greatest ninja, Nth Man is primarily occupied so far with the realities of total mechanized warfare in a world without nuclear weapons. The setup here gives us a war in which the Soviets have essentially rolled over much of Europe, leaving only Scandinavian partisan fighters to carry the fight, while the People's Liberation Army of China works in concert with the United States to expose Russia's eastern flank. This is a well-thought-out war game. Now let's see what happens when the omnipotent psychic decides to start throwing his weight around. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Giant Size Rune number 1 from 1994 in Malibu Comics. For all intents and purposes, we are nearing the end of the road for our boy Rune. This isn't the last Rune story that was ever published. No, would that it were. This is merely the beginning of the end of Barry Windsor Smith's involvement with the character. At the time, I was having more trouble making it to comic book stores regularly, so my perception was that the post-Marvel Ultraverse books just started to disappear. I've never even seen a copy of Rune 6, Windsor Smith's last regular issue, as well as the only time he ever drew Mantra. They weren't available on the newsstands where I still bought most of my comics, and when I could dip in, they were all heading in bad directions. Godwheel stands as the best historical demarcation. The end of whatever it was the Ultraverse could have been, the final dispensation of Larry Niven's contribution to the line's genesis, and the beginning of its half-life as a useless independence to the Marvel Universe. This hit stands the same month as the Godwheel, and from this point Windsor Smith only draws Rune a couple times more. The cover of Silver Surfer Rune, the Rune Conan crossover that followed at the end of the year, and that's pretty much it. This book here offers insight into Rune's origins as well as setting up new plot lines that could never be followed up with any satisfaction. After the purchase and after Marvel began to tentatively incorporate elements of the Ultraverse into the Marvel Universe, Rune would become fixated on the Infinity Gems and spend a lot of time messing about with Adam Warlock in a series of books that no one today can do more than vaguely gesture at, with the late 90s Ultraverse becoming a black hole of continuity, swallowing the contemporaneous iterations of multiple characters. A fitting end, perhaps, for the dark god of the void, an eternity in limbo. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Detective Comics 395 from 1969 in DC Comics, or rather, the Millennium Edition of same, released in 2000. This was released as part of DC's Turn of the Century reprint initiative, featuring new printings of the company's most significant books. The book's text piece informs us that this was the first winner of the initiative's online fan poll. Hard not to see why. This book marks the first Batman story by one of the most storied creative teams in comics, Denny O'Neil and Neil Adams. They did a number of Batman stories across the early 70s, in addition to their famous socially conscious run on Green Lantern, Green Arrow, and you can discern something of the shape of those later stories in The Secret of the Waiting Graves. Just the title should clue you in that this was an attempt at a darker, more macabre Batman yarn, a serious splash of cold water after the ebullient late 60s TV show had interrupted the company's early tentative steps in the direction of shifting the Dark Knight's tone away from the light touch that defined the character for multiple decades. The desire was strong to strip the character back to basics, or at least the idea of Batman's basics, a partially invented memory of the character's earliest years, basically before things got silly. Although this story isn't much on the face of it, a trifle involving Batman tracking down the secret of immortality in rural Mexico, there are hints of things to come. Just a year and a half later, O'Neil and Adams introduced a more substantial iteration of this same idea in the form of Ra's al Ghul, another ruthless immortal whose means of eternal life involve induced insanity. The backup features Robin, now college-aged, alone against campus agitators, a very timely preoccupation right down to the presence of communist infiltrators. The appeal here lies in Gil Kane's pencils. He already had one foot out the door in the direction of Marvel. Hard not to think he might have preferred drawing Spider-Man. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Marvel Tales Ms. Marvel from 2021 and yes, Marvel Comics. I continue to be over the moon for Marvel's recent Marvel Tales revival, reasonably priced reprint books with a shifting focus, reading copies of some of the company's most significant stories. I had read these stories before as they came out, but I wasn't buying individual issues very often at the time, so I didn't have any of these on my shelf. The first issue included is actually not a Ms. Marvel story, but an issue of Captain Marvel, number 17, from Kelly Sue DeConnick's influential run, that just happens to include a cameo from a young Kamala Khan. Her second appearance, as her first was apparently in the background for issue 14 of that same series. Issue 17 focuses on themes from that series which would become crucial to the spin-off. Carol Danvers, despite the mess of her own personal life, rife with amnesia, alcoholism, conflict with friends and family alike, is nevertheless an aspirational figure, someone whose heroism inspires others. This was both a crucial aspect of the character's success during this period and fully contiguous with her history. Carol only became a superhero in the first place because of the inspiration of the first Captain Marvell, the Kree warrior who betrayed his people for Earth and later died of cancer. Danvers was a romantic interest for Marvell that never really got off the ground, so there's a poignancy in Carol picking up the mantle from someone who, on balance, she never really got to know as well as she wanted before he was gone. Likewise for the younger Kamala Khan. Although she would meet Carol much later, for her Captain Marvel is a distant ideal, a figure on the news or in fanfic, a symbol more than an actual person, but a powerful symbol nonetheless, as Kamala learns in her earliest adventures here. Writer G. Willow Wilson is rightfully lauded for her sharp work defining the character, and her relationship with the older captain is endearingly clever. We know, of course, that Carol Danvers has always been a bit of a train wreck. That's my favorite part of Carol across multiple decades. But residents of the Marvel Universe who just see a striking blonde woman fighting monsters on the news can't but project their own ideas. Kamala's very first story plays into this directly. Her first experience shape-shifting, she actually becomes another person, and then freaks out over just how disorienting that is. Her origin story hinges to a great degree on her learning to accept herself and find strength in what she has: home, family, community, geography, instead of aspiring to something else. The kind of grounding that Kamala enjoys is, ironically, something Carol has never had as a character, given all the years she's struggled, sometimes even just to recognize the members of her own family. Adrian Alfona's art hits the balance between grit and whimsy. New Jersey comes alive, both as a slightly shabby urban environment and fanciful backdrop for Kamala's overactive imagination. These characters are expressive, highly caricatured without becoming caricatures. Another aspect of her origins I appreciate is the connection to the Inhumans franchise. And I'm being cheeky here, as someone who read the large part of Marvel's attempts to push the Inhumans across this period and found the effort range from wan to regrettable to excruciating. But this is nonetheless a grand comics tradition. Excellent characters emerge from crappy crossovers all the time. Ms. Marvel and Moon Girl both emerging from a frankly awful Inhumans event, just as Tommy Monahan emerged from Bloodlines and Miles Morales from Ultimatum, stands as a fictional character equivalent of paying one's dues. Howdy folks, today we're looking at the Rocketeer one-shot from 2023 in IDW. It's startling to look back and recall just how few Rocketeer stories Dave Stevens actually finished before his untimely demise. At this late date, many more pages of Rocketeer material have been produced by later creators than by Stevens himself. His actual Rocketeer work can all fit snug in a medium-sized trade. Still, they don't pull out the character very often, so a new appearance is always worth noting. So too here, a one-shot containing 3 short stories starring avenging aviator Cliff Secord and his girlfriend Betty. Trifles perhaps, but trifles nonetheless illustrated by Adam Hughes and Jay Lee. The first story, drawn by Hughes from a script by Danny Bilson and Paul DeMeo, posits a meeting between Cliff and Amelia Earhart, a sentimental theme but within acceptable range, given that you might recognize Bilson and DeMeo better as the screenwriters behind the 1991 Rocketeer feature film. The middle story, by Kelvin Mao and Craig Cermak, posits a meeting between Cliff and an unnamed archaeologist strongly implied to be Indiana Jones, down to the bullwhip and hat, cloying in another context, perhaps, but for the well-known fact that Stevens famously worked on storyboards for Raiders of the Lost Ark. Finally, Mao's collaborators for Image's recent Seven Sons also appear, closing out the book with 4 pages by Robert Wyndham and Jay Lee. It barely counts as a sketch, but 4 pages of The Rocketeer demolishing a Japanese Zero drawn by Jay Lee would still be the best comic just about any week it dropped. If it weren't also the same week we got a new Adam Hughes story. The fact that both stories are in the same book and that the book closes out with a pinup gallery featuring the likes of Hughes, Lee, and Phil Noto is pretty remarkable. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Silver Surfer Dangerous Artifacts from 1996 in Marvel Comics. No surprise if you've never heard of this book. It came out during one of the company's darkest moments, right in the midst of unprecedented industry turmoil and corporate contractions that very soon led the tottering giant to bankruptcy court. However, Marvel kept publishing all through those dark days. Whether or not the books were any good is another matter. For the most part, they really weren't, and given just how toxic a work environment the company had been for years at this point, it's no real surprise that it's not counted as one of the company's finer moments. But the occasional odd gem still managed to squeak through the fire, such as Dangerous Artifacts here. I'd go so far as to say, regardless of its obscurity, this is one of the most beautiful comics the company has ever published. Claudio Castellini is not particularly a household name, it's true. The reason why you may recognize him is that he drew Marvel's half of the Marvel vs. DC event that also came out this year. This is the book that got him that gig, working alongside the man who wrote Marvel's half of that event, Ron Mars. The story behind Dangerous Artifacts is pretty simple. Castellini took multiple years to draw this comic. Marvel never hurried him. They didn't rush out a book with the second half drawn by someone else. They just waited until the story was done and put it out there because it was clearly something that really only needed to exist because Castellini wanted to draw it. The story is fairly boilerplate for the Surfer, typical for Mars's tenure on the character. Galactus needs an errand boy, so he calls the Surfer. The Surfer never likes being summoned by his former boss, but usually relents when Galactus lays out a reasonable request. So too here, with the rediscovery of an ancient comet containing a mysterious power source of universal legend. The Surfer agrees any such artifacts are safer in Galactus' hands than anyone else, and so sets off for a rendezvous with the comet, around the same time that Thanos sends his own agent, the fetching White Raven, never seen again after this book. It shouldn't surprise you to hear the Kree and the Skrull are also after the comet, or that the mysterious power source turns out to be more than advertised. All well and good, but the fact remains, this comic is absolutely, unquestionably gorgeous, unfairly forgotten, and eminently worthy of rediscovery. That Castellini is almost forgotten today is due, I firmly believe, to calamitous timing. Had this masterpiece been released at just about any other time than 1996, it would have been lauded to the heavens. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Beware the Creeper #2 from 2003 in DC Vertigo. Our tour of 1920s Paris continues as the aftermath of last issue's calamitous assault slowly unfolds. The Creeper here is portrayed as a kind of hallucination of the collective unconscious, a reaction to the slow suffocation of Paris society under the blanket of nationalist conformity that saw the surrealists and all their kith as social parasites to be targeted and harassed. So, we're given brief introductions to topics such as automatic writing and the collective unconscious, perhaps the means by which the Creeper manifests in our world, or perhaps the Creeper is merely a woman in a leather leotard set out on vengeance for her sister's assault at the hands of a local grandee. As different as this iteration of the character is from our familiar Jack Ryder, the core of the creature remains intact. The Creeper is a mystery whose dual identity seems almost a form of possession. The focus of the Creeper's crusade is the Arbogast family, among the richest in the city and personally dedicated to stamping out the city's artists, seen by the idle rich as an advantageous infestation, a living symbol of the wrong types of people having developed unconscionable latitude since the end of the war. That's the shape of the story here, the post-war bourgeoisie embracing proto-fascist ideology as a guard against the social mobility unleashed by the Great War. The Arbogast family uses their fortune as a cudgel, mobilizing the gendarme against the artist whose work, however couched in the language of mysticism and obscurantism, is nevertheless preoccupied with social discontent in the midst of grossly uneven recovery. There's a mystery afoot between the story's main characters, twins Judith and Madeline, not seen together since the first issue's climax. Who actually is the mysterious Creeper? Did Judith even survive her assault at the hands of the Arbogast scion? Howdy folks, today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja #3 from 1989 in Marvel Comics. Let's step back today for a closer look at the art by Ron Wagner with inks by Fred Fredericks. Wagner was 5 years into his career by now. Like a number of early Kubert School graduates, his early credits are on Sergeant Rock, as well as various odds and ends like the 80s incarnation of Hex and First Comics Badger. However, it's once he gets picked up by Marvel that he really hits his stride, working with writer Larry Hama on G.I. Joe for much of 1987 and 88, in addition to various covers for books like Conan and the Nam. Undoubtedly, it was that facility with men's adventure stories that made him such an ideal partner for Hama. In the first place, he's committed to providing the technical accuracy that Hama's stories demand. Nth Man is filled not just with military hardware, but precise military hardware. This is the kind of series with frequent editorial notes detailing specific vehicles and weapons used by Soviet forces. In some comics, it might not matter that much, but in this comic, it definitely matters quite a bit that the armored troop carriers and attack helicopters look at least vaguely like they're supposed to. Valuable verisimilitude in a comic wherein action sequences depend on the precise usage of wire-guided anti-tank missiles. The main antagonist here is a MIL Mi-24 helicopter gunship, and a quick Google search tells me that Wagner got it right. That chopper was introduced by the Soviets in '72 and is apparently still in use by armies across the world. Not a small detail. Much of this issue spent setting up a massive tank battle between Soviet forces and the Chinese People's Army. The success of the story depends on the degree to which the reader understands that these are real weapons with real limitations, not magic toy accessories drawn to accommodate the whims of story. None of this works without a patient artist who cares to take the time to get it right. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Rune Silver Surfer #1 from both Malibu and Marvel Comics in 1995. We reach now the end of the line, with the passing of Rune from being one of the most exciting and memorable books of its era to being garbage stuck into barely legible crossovers. Am I being overly harsh? It's hard not to see the drop-off here. The Windsor Smith cover is pure tease, underlying an unflattering comparison between what had been and what was yet to come. This story picks up the moment following the conclusion of Godwheel. That was the Ultraverse's second big crossover following the previous breakthrough, and the beginning of the line's greater engagement with the Marvel Universe. The plot of Godwheel featured the main players of the Ultraverse exploring an alien artifact a long way from Earth, a massive disc spinning around a distant star like a giant vinyl record. If you're thinking that sounds kind of like a variant on Larry Niven's Ringworld, you should know the Godwheel was Niven's idea, part of the initial brainstorming that created the cosmology of the original Ultraverse. Well, none of that matters anymore, because the last plot twist in Godwheel consisted of the mighty Thor being transported from the Marvel Universe to the Godwheel to help the Ultras. After the last page of that story, we see what happens next here. Rune takes one look at Thor, realizes he's in a different weight class than any of the bozos he's been fighting in the Ultraverse, and makes a play to eat Thor, to which Thor smacks Rune so hard he lands in New York, Marvel's New York. From there, it's a small matter for him to figure out the juiciest target in the new buffet, which at this point in 95 was the Infinity Watch. You know, the group put together by Warlock to safeguard the Infinity Gems following the first Infinity Gauntlet. Well, if you've ever wanted to know what happened to the first Infinity Watch, here's your answer. Rune works his way through them like a knife through butter and very quickly reassembles the Infinity Gauntlet, at which point the Living Tribunal realizes what's going on and dispatches the Silver Surfer to put a stop to it. The end result, after the Surfer goes a few rounds with Death Urge for some reason, is that the Surfer catches up to Rune and blows the Dark God's hand right off, which, because the story dictates, means the Infinity Gems were scattered to the four corners of the Ultraverse, at which point the story is picked up by Loki, leading to Black September and the Ultraverse Avengers crossover. Whatever juiceberry Windsor Smith brought to the table has been well squeezed. The Ultraverse half is drawn by a very young Henry Flint, who would go on to do much better work for 2000 AD. This looks as if it were drawn in a hurry. The Marvel half was drawn by John Buscema in one of his periodic returns to the Surfer. Also not the first time Buscema followed Windsor Smith on a strip for what it's worth. But the later Buscema oftentimes struggled to mask his lack of enthusiasm for superhero strips, and the desultory inking job doesn't have much to offer here against that. A wholly disappointing epilogue to a tragically abbreviated masterpiece. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at What If Volume 1, number 24 from 1980 in Marvel Comics. The cover blurb informs us this is the most eagerly awaited What If of all, and for once it's not hard to believe the hype, for this issue dares to answer the question, what if Gwen Stacy had lived? If you're familiar with the conventions of What If, you know the answer to that question is almost certainly nothing good. What If, in most of its incarnations, is devoted to showing just how badly things could go, were it not for handy guardrails placed around the circumference of most characters. As awful as Gwen Stacy's death, then, the alternative must have been even worse, right? What If was one of my very favorite series growing up. Coming of age during the run of the second volume meant that the first volume became the first series I seriously collected. This issue is notable among the annals of What If for being one of but a handful of examples of the original creators returning to their own story, in that this book is penciled by the same man who drew the original death of Gwen Stacy in Amazing Spider-Man number 121, Gil Kane. The writer is Tony Isabella, Bronze Age stalwart for both Marvel and DC, and noted raconteur to this day. Anyway, if you're curious as to how things go pear-shaped for Peter in a world where his one true love survives, it all comes back to the Green Goblin. A world in which Gwen survives is a world in which Peter doesn't manage to kill the Goblin either. One in which the Goblin, at least, walks away with a happy-ish ending, having been at least temporarily saved by the love of his son Harry. But not before the Goblin wreaks his greatest revenge, dropping a dime to J. Jonah Jameson regarding the secret identity of a certain wall-crawling gadfly. So, we are given the heartwarming spectacle of Gwen and Peter actually tying the knot in front of their friends and family, only to see the wedding interrupted by Jameson in the front of a column of policemen, ready to arrest Spider-Man for all his various perceived misdeeds. The shock gives poor Aunt May a heart attack and consigns Peter to either the life of an outlaw or a criminal defendant on what should have been the happiest day of his life. The story ends on a cliffhanger with no resolution for the impossible choice left to Peter by Osborn's perfidy. The back end of the book features one of the series' periodic Untold Tales of the Marvel Universe features, the bulk of which was devoted to further integrating Kirby's Eternals with the history of the larger Marvel Universe. This backup is devoted to the Eternal Civil War, which saw the population of the Eternals split between two cities at the dawn of history, one in the Antarctic wastes of Earth and another on the distant moon of Titan. Sort of. There's a lot more to that story, as you might imagine, especially after 44 years of subsequent developments in the matter. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at World's Finest number 302 from 1984 in DC Comics. Although it might not seem like it, this humble issue of World's Finest contains a significant milestone in comic book history. Now, I'm not referring to the main story, a reprint from 1968 featuring an early pencil job by Neil Adams on Superman and Batman. Although Adams had been at DC for not even a full year at the time, his style was already plastered across the line. Not just the early, groundbreaking strips like Deadman and Spectre, but his covers for much of the rest of the Superman and Batman families had given the company a tangible shot in the arm after years of gradually slipping behind the upstart Marvel. Writer Cary Bates was by then an old hand at the art of stuffing Batman and Superman into one strip. Often the results were busy and slightly delirious, and so too here, with not just the two leads, but also Supergirl, Batgirl, Robin, and even Jimmy Olsen jammed into a shaggy dog story about a dying actor. It's more or less a cheat on multiple levels, par for the course if you've ever read 60s DC. Although, I must admit the part about Superman getting in touch with Batgirl by pretending to be the living statue of General Ulysses Grant was rather inspired. In any event, this was 1984, and the only reason this story ever saw print would have been someone blowing a deadline. But there is one new feature in this magazine, behind the Adams reprint. Look in the very back and you'll find 5 pages drawn by none other than David Mazzucchelli in his first work for DC and his first at-bat drawing The Dark Knight. It's about as odd and uncharacteristic a Batman story as you could hope to find. Batman and Superman find themselves in Australia following a recent battle and walk into a bar, literally just to have a few minutes downtime chewing the fat and sharing a glass of milk. The joke, such as it is that everyone else at the bar thinks it's a put-on and wants to start a fight. Big things come from small beginnings. Hard to discern, perhaps, the outlines of future greatness, but in just 3 short years he would be back for year 1. Talk about a learning curve. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Loki number 1 from Marvel Comics in 2023. For all that veteran readers bewail the influence of the movies over the books and can point out seemingly countless instances of the former influencing the latter for the worse, it's also important to acknowledge those instances when the movies have had a positive influence. The number 1 example on that list is the subject of our story today, Loki. No one was thinking of Thor's evil stepbrother as a leading man in any capacity prior to the first Thor movie. Hiring an attractive younger man to play the character represented a true paradigm shift. After Tom Hiddleston, no one was ever going to want to go back to boring old decrepit Loki with a face like a shovel. Since then, the post-movie Loki has proven to be one of Marvel's more interesting franchises. Thanks to the work of folks like Kieran Gillen and Al Ewing, he's carved himself a unique niche at the company as a contemporary fantasy strip that owes more to Gaiman's work on Sandman than Lee or Kirby or even Simonson. So with that in mind, I picked up the first issue of the new run with no expectations whatsoever, other than a general fondness for the character, or at least how he's been written for the last decade and change. There's nothing wrong, per se, with this new launch, but I found myself struggling to engage. The story picks up with one of the more gruesome bits of the Loki myth, the sailing ship Naglfar, created from the fingernails of the dead. It's appeared in the comics periodically, and this story gets underway after someone steals the ship for a joyride. Loki makes the mistake of ordering his new subjects in Jotunheim to learn to read, you see, which certainly isn't going to come back and bite him at multiple points, no. So, a couple rather less than bright frost giants steal his ship and accidentally fly into the World Tree, creating unpleasant consequences for all the 10 realms. There's nothing really wrong with Dan Waters' story here, but there's also a little outside what I would expect from a Loki solo story either. It's Loki, doing Loki things, with admittedly very nice art by Germán Peralta. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Warriors of Plasm number 1 from 1993 in Defiant Comics. At 30 years removed, I think it's more than fair to say this is one of the strangest comic books ever printed. That's not to say it's bad. On the contrary, there's a lot of good to be found here. As unlikely as it seems, this book is a crucial step in the evolution of David Lapham, halfway between his early formative work for Valiant and his debut as a self-publisher with the universally lauded Stray Bullets. He learned a great deal from writer Jim Shooter over the course of their acquaintance, and you can see that education on every page. Not every artist could could handle the challenge of creating an entirely new sci-fi world filled with strange creatures and based on strange biological technologies, but Lapham answers the challenge with vigor. As unusual as practically every element of this comic is, Lapham makes it work. This should be an unbridled mess, but it reads fine. There's a great deal of information in terms of setting and premise that has to be communicated almost solely through art, but there's no confusion here. That's a minor miracle, considering the actual content of the story is unreservedly bizarre. There's an evil dimension called Plasm. It's run by a fascistic death cult that controls the biological technology that maintains itself by constantly recycling living creatures back into its biomass. They've set their sights on Earth for further biomass conversion. The story introduces us to 5 humans kidnapped and forced to fight for Earth against the invading Plasm. Now, the important thing to remember is that this wasn't some below-the-radar indie book. This was the lead title for Jim Shooter's Defiant, the publishing outfit he started after being unceremoniously booted from the previous company he started, Valiant, which is where he met Lapham. A very strange, surprisingly horny book that was immediately sued into oblivion by Marvel, composted back into the biomass of a nation's quarter boxes. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Beware the Creeper number 3 from 2003 in DC Vertigo. The saga continues as the mysterious Creeper continues her one-woman reign of terror across the streets of 1920s Paris, or at least her reign of terror against the wealthy and comfortable. The Arbogast baby, stolen at the end of the previous issue, turns up safe and sound, hanging in a bundle from a statue of Joan of Arc. The Creeper's celebrity only grows as she's embraced by the hoi polloi. Everyone who isn't rich and comfortable enjoys seeing the wealthy humiliated, while the wealthy apply increasing pressure to the Parisian police to find the woman responsible for their repeated embarrassment. The crucial element here is Cliff Chang's eye for architecture and scenery. The story works as well as it does because Chang puts in the work to make sure the Paris on the page actually resembles the Paris intimately familiar from decades of media. It's not merely putting the Eiffel Tower in the background, although that august landmark is featured prominently here. It's the ancient churches and 18th century apartment blocks, wide boulevards and narrow alleys. It's beyond cliche to say that a setting becomes a character, but this story is inextricably about Paris. This was an era of often violent social change, symbolized for our characters by the sudden congestion of automobiles and advertising. The entire city becomes fixated on the Creeper because, as we see, the entire city is primed for mass media spectacle. She interrupts the performance of a stage magician, one Luigi Zitara, attended by real-life Magus Aleister Crowley, in the company of the Shade, a slightly less real Magus. This cameo serves as a small but integral connection to James Robinson's larger continuity project. With this attention to architectural detail, careful situation within an art historical context, and sly nods to more familiar comic book characters, we see Beware the Creeper in its fullness as a direct offspring of Robinson's Starman. Never actually a Vertigo book, owing to its deep ties to the larger DC universe, but nevertheless smarter than almost anything else produced by the main line in those years. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Nth Man, the Ultimate Ninja number 4 from Marvel Comics in 1989. The opening narration informs us that we are somewhere southeast of Moscow, 6 months and 3 days after the start of World War III. After 2 issues of build-up, the battle is caught up to our heroes, still marooned on the steppes of Russia after the first issue's daring rescue. John Doe, Sergeant Levin, and Irving Yagyu DDS are still cruising around in a stolen personnel carrier filled with children rescued from a Russian village demolished by the Chinese offensive, but soon find themselves on foot after an American airstrike of a Soviet field hospital demolishes their wheels. Our unlikely trio find themselves hunted by the series' main antagonist to date, Colonel Varvara Novikova, a woman whose life depends on retaking the prisoner who escaped from under her watch. This issue is all about the fog of war, characters screaming in the darkness because they're dying, lost, or in shock. Shock isn't something a lot of war stories want to deal with, but also one of the inevitable consequences of life in wartime. The screams of a distraught Russian nurse open up a memory inside John Doe of a flashback to his and Alfie's childhood in the Iowa orphanage in which they were raised. The psychic connection between Doe and Alfie channels all these memories right back to the surface for our titular Ultimate Ninja, so we see the vivid recollection of anguish felt by the orphanage's cook on learning that her son had been killed in Vietnam. The story cuts back and forth between Alfie's psychic flashbacks and the present, with Colonel Novikova ordering a group of naval infantrymen to hunt down Doe through the tall grass in the dark, with a spearhead of Chinese armor bearing down on their position. John Doe snaps back to reality just in time to help mow down the naval infantry, thanks to the scent of Colonel Novikova's brand of perfume, Calvin Klein's Obsession. As if this story couldn't be any more of an 80s period piece. One of Hama's themes from G.I. Joe, underlined here for repeated emphasis. There's no ideology present for troops on the ground fighting a war. There are orders and there's motivated reasoning. Everything else falls by the wayside. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Slain the Horned God #1 from 1993 in Fleetway quality. Slain was created 40 years ago in Prague 330 of 2000 AD by Pat Mills and Angela Kincaid. In the decade since, the characters appeared many times, drawn by a host of estimable artists, but written only by Mills. However, growing up in the United States as I did, the legend of one particular run on the character overshadowed every other incarnation, Slain the Horned God. This was Simon Bisley's breakthrough in 1989, fresh off his earliest work on the ABC Warriors just the year previous and leading right into his stateside debut on Lobo for DC. This American reprint shipped in 1993, but it wasn't the first time the material had seen print over here, portions having been reprinted in Heavy Metal magazine 2 years previous. There was demonstrably great excitement over these stories in the years after they initially saw print. These were important strips, with Bisley's work here casting a shadow over the succeeding decade. If you've never had the pleasure, Slain is the story of the titular ancient Celtic warrior king, a profane, violent, and highly sexual strip, not for the faint of heart in any of its incarnations. Slain is an impulsive, occasionally brutal man, wielding the mighty war axe Brainbiter while suffering the fearsome warp spasm, a state of mystical battle frenzy. The Horned God is the story of Slain's quest for the power to unite the tribes of the Earth Goddess against the Lord Weird Sloch Feg. This quest entails climbing down into a magic cauldron and communing with the Earth Goddess. And if you think communing with the Earth Goddess is a euphemism, it most definitely is. Bisley earned his reputation not merely for drawing unspeakable acts of violence, but also surpassingly beautiful women. Painted comics were still at the time a considerable novelty on either side of the Atlantic, but that was changing very quickly. What strikes me the most about early Bisley in hindsight is how clearly he wore the influence of Frank Frazetta, also a cartoonist and not coincidentally one of the greatest painters of motion who has ever lived. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Atari Force #3 from 1984 in DC Comics. From a certain angle, the story of Atari Force is a tragedy, and a familiar tragedy to boot. Stop me if you've heard this one before. A licensed comic that had no business being any good somehow managed to be great, defying the odds to become a fan favorite prior to the license passing out of the hands of the original publisher, in the process leaving the beloved classic in perpetual limbo. Add in the work in question being monumentally influential, some of the most famous art by one of the industry's greatest craftsmen, and you have Atari Force, by Jerry Conway and Jose Luis Garcia Lopez. The series began as a run of mini-comics included with actual Atari game cartridges during the video game boom of the early 80s, before those characters and settings matriculated to the world of full-size comics in 1983. If you're wondering just what this book has to do with the Atari 2600 game console, the answer is not a whole heck of a lot, which only adds to the tragedy of such distinctive and original characters being owned by a video game company that had no intention of ever doing anything with fan-favorite characters like Dart or Pack-Rat. The actual plot of the book follows a ragtag group of space adventurers in the not-too-distant future of 2028, and this issue from early in the run is still focused on pulling the team together. Now, of course, there are lots of licensed comics from yesteryear that don't rate anywhere near as much nostalgia, but there are concrete reasons to be on the lookout for this series whenever you may come across it in the bins. This is some of the best work of Garcia Lopez's career. You may say, well, Garcia Lopez never really turned in bad work, and I'd agree with that assertion. But this right here is prime time for one of the strongest draftsmen in the history of comics. None other than Mobius himself stood in awe of Garcia Lopez's facility with figure drawing, and that facility is on display on every page here. His work is aided by the ink line of Ricardo Villagrán, as supple and controlled as you could hope for, with layouts as crisp as Garcia Lopez, atmospheric and even sexy as the story dictated. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at the Uncanny X-Men Days of Future Past from 1989 in Marvel Comics. If you were lucky enough to be buying the run of classic X-Men in the late 80s, you might just remember the series skipped over issues 141 through 142 of the original run of Uncanny from 1980. The reason for that can be found here in this deluxe reprint that shipped around the same time. I still remember very keenly the precise vacation shopping trip where I got this, and proceeded to read it multiple times. I think everyone I knew who read comics ended up reading this, including even my parents. This came out during a period when the main title was still more or less inscrutable for anyone who hadn't been reading for years. Even after I'd been on board for a while, I found the post-Australia year to be baffling and frankly forbidding. But this and the main run of Classic did a good job of teaching me just what the big deal was supposed to be with these guys. The main main book sure wasn't, sad to say. The story, if you've never had the pleasure, is fairly familiar, in that it's been cribbed a number of times. In order to prevent a dire dystopian future where everyone they love has been killed by an evil robot, the surviving X-Men send one survivor back in time in order to try and nudge the timeline just enough that the awful future's averted. They did a movie version of this storyline in 2014 with Wolverine in Kitty Pryde's place, and they also did a movie version in 1984 called The Terminator and directed by James Cameron. The most remarkable aspect of Days of Future Past, from our perspective in 2023, given that we know just how popular the X-Men franchise would go on to be, is just how critical this one storyline would become for the popularity of the franchise. It's not like every subsequent storyline became fixated on this single two-parter, no, and in fact even Claremont waited many years before returning when he reintroduced Rachel Summers to the team some 40-odd issues later. The critical element was actually the timing here. Days of Future Past was released hot on the heels of the conclusion of the epical Dark Phoenix saga, which had just wrapped in issue 137, and was already at that moment hailed as one of the signature stories of its era, alongside Frank Miller's Electra cycle, in terms of both popularity and influence. Absolutely no one would have been surprised or even particularly disappointed if Dark Phoenix had been the ceiling. No one could have foreseen that it would merely be the conclusion of Claremont's first era on the book, or, for that matter, that the departure of superstar penciler John Byrne wouldn't cripple its forward momentum. Well, it didn't. Byrne left for Fantastic Four right after the story was published, replaced by the man he had replaced, David Cockrum. The book didn't stop selling, and it didn't stop being good. What should have been a valedictory spin turned out to be a shot in the arm. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Xeno #1, a new sci-fi anthology from Oni Comics. Now, I say sci-fi because these stories definitely are that, but they're all of them also touched by horror to a greater or lesser degree. Like many such cautionary stories regarding technology, there's a barb at the end of these tales. In the first place, I should say, this is a tremendously stacked anthology. There are 4 stories, each designed to show off their artist in the best light, and each of them look dynamite. Melissa Flores and Daniel Irizarry lead off with Hugh, a story about artificial eyes. The horror here is not that the implants cost millions of dollars and are unavailable to all but a lucky few. That's a given, of course. The real catch here is that our guinea pig, when Mateo Mendoza finds he can see things no one else can, such as evil monsters dwelling outside the range of human sight and sneaking into our bedrooms every night. Next, we have Jordan Thomas and Shaky Kane with Rabbit Trap. Kane's a favorite, and I'd have purchased the book just for him. Like much of Kane's work, this is overtly political, an alien invasion yarn set during the height of Cold War paranoia. The third slot is given over to the veteran creator Phil Hester, long a favorite of mine, tracing back to his days on Swamp Thing, back during the Pleistocene epoch. She took the air as a claustrophobic story about the struggle for survival after the end of the world, and it doesn't end on a hopeful note. Finally, the volume rounds out with The Chip by Chris Condon and Nick Cagnetti. Cagnetti's a newer face on the scene, but quickly becoming one of my favorites due to his revelatory work on Pink Lemonade, also from Oni. The plot's about video games that might actually be mind control. Gavin is a gamer, and he's not picky about cutting-edge technology, at least until he finds a bloody Garrett in the trash. Does it say something about our relationship to technology that it's become so easy to imagine new technology as an existential threat? The common thread between the first and last stories in the collection is a lack of meaningful oversight or consequence for the corporations playing with people's lives. A good horror story in a book like this needs to be nasty, and it needs to really twist the knife. If EC taught us anything, it's that nothing good comes of a horror story pulling its punches. Well, no punches are pulled here at any point. Howdy folks, today we're looking at Batman Legends of the Dark Knight number 85 from 1996 in DC Comics. The name of the game here is Tony Salmons, a distinctive presence across multiple decades. Legends of the Dark Knight was an anthology title devoted to the earliest era of the character's adventures, beginning in 1989 and running for well over a decade. In practice, the book was at its best an artist showcase, allowing creators to spread their wings at a slight remove from the pressures of contemporary continuity. Tony Salmons was already a rare sight by 1996, having long decamped to Hollywood and lucrative work in the animation industry after a fractious first decade in comics that saw him supposedly blackballed from Jim Shooter's Marvel. His work for Dakota North by itself would qualify him for a place among the greats. Sadly, the years since the turn of the century have seen him turning away from comics almost entirely. Because his work was so rare, every line he committed to paper seems a precious resource worthy of study. The object of our video today is, on the face of it, as pure a storytelling exercise as possible. Batman climbs a skyscraper to reach his target, a mobster who's weaponized the entire building for the purpose of killing intruders. So, Batman has to fight an angry gorilla, a swarm of hungry alligators, an army of armed hitmen, and axe-wielding thugs. There are booby traps, robotic statuary, machine gun nests, every kind of obstacle you can imagine standing between Batman and his quarry. The writer here is James Robinson, whose Batman is appropriately pared down, a figure of drive and prowess, ultimately resourceful in the face of every obstacle. It's a virtue of Robinson that for the most part he knows how to get out of the way of his artists. The story here, such as it is, tees up Sammons to do what he does best, showcase motion and figure drawing in the most dynamic manner possible. His ink line is really something else, by turns febrile and chunky, informed by Kirby and Munoz, while also inescapably distinctive. Sammons' true mastery is in the field of gesture and expression. His compositions are throughout dictated by organic movement, that protean line the ultimate tool to counterfeit motion on the still and quiet page. Howdy, folks. Today we're looking at Beware the Creeper #4 from DC Vertigo in 2003. After 3 issues of building pressure, the streets of Paris finally hit full boil. The Creeper reaches her zenith at the precise moment the police put serious muscle into the crackdown. It's all become a bit of a fad. We see entire costume balls dedicated just to dressing up like the Creeper, including the stage getup of one Josephine Baker. Everything has gotten just a little bit out of hand, to the degree that it hardly surprises when the bodies start dropping. Now, a word about the coloring here, since I haven't mentioned it before. It's the work of Mr. Dave Stewart, a stalwart presence across some of the industry's biggest books during this period. This book, for better or for worse, serves as an abject example of a historical phenomenon known as the Vertigo Browns, referring to the tendency for Vertigo books from the period, along with anything that courted that same aesthetic, to go overboard on dark hues, the likes of which often came out to little more than an unappealing brown muddle. To a degree, I think the phenomenon is as much an artifact of the early computer era as anything. Just as the late 90s was studded with colorful books, colored many shades too dark from being produced on bright CRT monitors, so too were a disproportionate number of books from the years directly after, saddled with overly subtle color work that reproduced poorly and did a frank disservice to the material. That's not the case here, I want to emphasize. This is gorgeous color work, well chosen, dark throughout, but also perfectly balanced. The highlights, such as the Creeper's red plume, pop when they appear, but you can see how, in lesser hands than Stewart, this approach might falter, might seem repetitive to the point of dulling the impact of less superlative art than Chang.